Introduction. Over the hills and far away. A few years ago, a British friend and I drove down to Cornwall to ring in the summer solstice at a small sylvan estate called Woodfield. Mark brought a raft of CDs, obscure garage, Japanese psychedelia, Finnish prog, but the rental car only had a tape deck. Driving along the M5 was boring, so when we hit a pit stop I casually scanned the racks of overpriced cassettes. Nothing grabbed me until my eyes fell across an old codger lugging a load of wood along a country road. Or rather, the image of said codger framed against a peeling wall. It was a copy of that literally nameless slab of luminous rune rock we must stoop to dub Led Zeppelin for, or Four Symbols, or Zozo. Though it was never my favourite Zepp record, I alternate between free and physical graffiti, I picked up the tape figuring that 10 quid wasn't too terribly much for a nostalgic lark on a dull journey. It was my first time in southwestern England, and Mark suggested that we get off the M5 and take a detour through Glastonbury, which lies in the Shire, or whatever you call it, of Somerset. Glastonbury is Britain's mystic Mecca, a densely layered fairy cake of fantasy and lore that stretches back into the ages. And it is a weird place. Besides a ruined Gothic abbey and a reconstructed sacred well, the hamlet features a high hill known as the Tor, an odd natural feature, topped with a lonely tower that looms over the surrounding landscape like some pagan barrow mound. Glastonbury was once surrounded by swamps, and ancient tales identified the place as the Isle of Avalon, the Celtic overworld where the wounded King Arthur was dragged to die. Other celebrity visitors are supposed to have included Joseph of Arimathea, said to have sailed from Jerusalem to Glastonbury with the Holy Grail in hand, there to found one of the first churches in Christendom. During the Middle Ages, Glastonbury's monks made much of these tales, going so far as to dig up the bones of Arthur. Their marketing savvy made the abbey England's holiest pilgrimage site until Henry VIII had the abbot drawn and quartered on the Tor. In the 19th century, the crumbling monastery and Ferris Spring nearby started attracting British occultists, and today the Tor is routinely topped with New Agers, grotty hippies, and crop circle chasers measuring ley lines with curious electrical machines. We approached the town from the east, driving into the enveloping dusk. Despite a wince from Mark, I had slapped on the Zepp tape after getting off the M5, settling into grooves so familiar that the car speakers seemed merely to amplify waveforms lifted from my own neural circuitry. As the chiming, the Battle of Evermore faded into the opening flutter of Stairway to Heaven, that matchless and ridiculous wedding song, the Tor rose up before us against bruised and blazing colours. A splash of light suddenly illuminated the tower, as if myriad wee folk had just whipped out their Bics. As the band clambered up their sonic stairway, I melted into a profound and adolescent reverie. I recalled a childhood dream of Nordic fjords, and a particularly skunky bong load beneath the California stars, and my most incandescent high school crush, a blonde named Barbara Zink, whom I half believed was a white witch. I gazed past the Tor, past the golden heaps of cloud beyond, and there was a feeling I got as I looked to the west, a feeling that reminds me now of a passage from Lord Dunsany, one of the first and finest writers of the modern fantasy tale. In the blood of man there is a tide, an old sea current rather, that is somehow akin to the twilight, which brings him rumours of beauty from however far away, as driftwood is found at sea from islands not yet discovered, and this springtide of current that visits the blood of man comes from the fabulous quarter of his lineage, from the legendary, the old. It takes him out to the woodlands, out to the hills. He listens to ancient song. Now, what I was listening to was Stairway to Heaven, the anthem that launched 1,000 keggers, a song more tired than ancient, like a coin-worfen Finn or an old Polack joke, and yet I felt the same tide of pagan legend surging through my chest. So it was as if a peculiar blend of awe and shame, but I turned to Mark and said, "You have no idea what this moment means." He just laughed at me, and we in our shadows turned from the Tor and drove into town. I want to stay with this moment a bit because when you want to write about an album as massive and canonical as the fourth Led Zeppelin record, you need an in, and this Twilight Reverie is my in. For Twilight was not a power lost on this band. Their swan song logo was ripped from an obscure 19th century painting called Evening, Fall of the Day, while their last great ode to sexual angst was In the Evening. But my favourite moment of crepuscular Zepp occurred in 1970, when the band turned down high-paying gigs in Boston and New Haven to play a major outdoor summer festival at Bath, which happens to lie about 30 miles from the Glastonbury Tor. At the time, America had already showered the band of Love and Luca, but England was playing hard to get. Bath, with its ace lineup and 150,000 attendees, was a chance for Led Zeppelin to triumph on their own turf. The weather was crap during the day, but by the end of the afternoon it was clear that a dramatic sunset would soon fall upon the land. Peter Grant, Zeppelin's behemoth bruiser of a manager, had already arranged to have the band hit the stage at 8 o'clock sharp, so that dusk would bloom behind them as the stage lights came on. But as the hour approached, an act called The Flock continued to play, drawing out the encores as the sun disappeared. Grant told Zepp's mischievous roadie King Richard Cole, the orchestrator of much mayhem and later a Tattletale Supreme, to terminate the performance. So Cole and a few roadies walked on stage, unplugged the Flock's gear and started lugging it away. When a Flock roadie objected, the story goes, Grant hauled off and slugged him. Cole supposedly threw some punches as well. In any case, Zeppelin got their way. A bearded Robert Plant walked into the sun's dwindling spotlights with blue jeans bulging while Jimmy Page wrapped himself against the wind in a tweed topcoat and a goofy Gilligan cap. Laughing into Immigrant Song, they hammered home their dominion. From this episode, we draw forth Zeppelin's motto, magic by any means necessary. And it is this rough magic that I'll try to explore in this book you hold. We have all experienced the magic of music. Its narcotic gift of transport, its manner of weaving together memory and imagination, of sharpening feelings to a keen blade. But in Zeppelin's case, we must take this cliche almost literally, and not just because Jimmy Page is almost certainly the best-selling black magician in the history of recorded music. For though Page probably cast some mighty spells in his very dungeons, I know nothing of them. What I know is that Led Zeppelin, with great cunning and an elemental command of light and shade, crafted records into mythic enchantments, and nowhere more so than on their fourth album. As you can probably tell, I write as one once thoroughly enchanted. As with many boys, and some girls, growing up in the long fade of classic rock culture, Led Zeppelin offered me more than a soundtrack for getting loaded and making out. Listening and loving the band was also a rite of passage, a guided journey through an internal landscape that was changing as dramatically as the body and the loins and the world were changing. The novelist Michael Chabon has written that the imagination is perhaps the only sure capital that teenagers possess, a jealousy-guarded fortress of solitude, flush of violence and fantasies of power. In my case, the fortress is also inscribed with the symbols of the occult. I grew up along the Southern California coast, surrounded by the spent fuel rockets of the spiritual counterculture, and I definitely absorbed some of the hazy hippie mysticism in the air. I smoked pot, dropped acid, and stared into mirrors to provoke hallucination. I practiced lucid dreaming, and once awoke in a vaulted Maxfield parish heaven, only to guide my doppelganger to some shoddy simulacrum of AP Trig, where I poured the pert astral breasts of a girl whose name I have long forgotten. I wrote Lovecraftian poetry and decorated my walls with Roger Dean posters, maps of Middle-earth, and hermetic diagrams ripped from the myth and magic books I lifted from the library. Girls I knew wanted pop stars or jocks. I wanted the girls, but if I couldn't have them, I'd take wizardry, the invisible rebellion of the internal life. And no one offered a better song cycle for my escape into shadow than Led Zeppelin. In his delirious pot-boiler Hammer of the Gods, Stephen Davis called the band a mystery cult with several million initiates. It's more than a metaphor. Zeppelin offered fans a peculiarly powerful mytho-poetic identification beyond the boundaries of the music itself. As Andy Fife writes, Led Zepp 4 plus The Lord of the Rings plus Discovering Girls and Booze equals very powerful teenage male experience. Sure, it was cock rock, but it was also a mystery. Wrapped in an enigma, stuffed into a cock. Zepp's theatrical soundscapes, cool covers, and scattered allusions to the Lord of the Rings served as a secret wink, an affirmation that between the cracks of what I already suspected was going to turn out to be a rather disenchanted world, nestled some resplendent other. Led Zeppelin knew something, but they weren't fessing. If only I could decode those 4 notorious sigils, I thought. If only I could turn the idiotic wheel on the cover of Led Zeppelin 3 in just the right way. Then these figures would tell their tales. The Queen of Light, the Keepers of the Gloom, the Black Dog, the guy named Roy Harper. Then I'd know who was going to receive that nude girl child held aloft inside the gatefold of Houses of the Holy. The born-again surfers in my typing class knew Satan. While I wasn't ready to go that far, it wasn't clear to me, then or now, which side of the Force made Zeppelin's majesty. Sure, Robert Plant seemed more like a randy, hippie pretty boy than a servant of the pit, but Jimmy Page, obsessed with the willfully scandalous occultist Aleister Crowley, was another story. Posters on my wall showed Page immersed in what Bowie called Crowley's uniform of imagery. The silk threads emblazoned with poppies and megastars, the SS cap, the slit puffy eyelids that lent his face a stoned Orientalism, the Les Paul sung so low it plugged into the Muladhara chakra, where the Kundalini coils. This was not a wholesome man. Like so many fans, I heard about the soul swap rumors, the occult bookstore, the haunted mansion near Loch Ness. Digging deeper, I devoured and then destroyed John Simon's 1951 Crowley biography, The Great Beast, whose scandalous and seductive hyperbole in some ways anticipates Hammer of the Gods. My studies did not end there. For me, as for many, Led Zeppelin served as an occult gateway drug, a comic book portal into esoterica with its fantastic ruins and bewitching herbs and maps of realms beyond the fields we know. For better and for worse, I owe them for this. This book, then, is a sort of tribute, an ode to the Himalaya of heavy rock, a paganish take on rock and roll, ring raves, and the iconic fetish of the gatefold LP. I write not as a believer, but as an occulture critic, fascinated with esoteric lore, but convinced of no secret keys beyond the central revelation of the human imagination. So though I will take Led Zeppelin's magic seriously, I won't, I hope, be too serious about it. I'm certainly not interested in sprinkling more pixie dust on a band already bloated with myth, or in speculating about what Page was up to in the basements of Boleskine. Instead, I want to tease up the gossamer thread of mystery that Plant describes above, the one that so narrowly separates darkness and intrigue, and then just see where it leads. The spectres may not be real, but I just call them as I see them. Such a course is arguably dangerous when dealing with such a powerful, seductive, and as they say, problematic band, for Zeppelin has been accused of many evils besides devil worship. Today's more academic rock discourses, where the group has become an important point of reference in a number of pitched debates, Zepp have drawn accusations of phallocentrism, orientalism, colonialism, fascism, misogyny, and the crass appropriation of African American intellectual property. There is much of value to these debates, although they seem to have been handled best by scholars generally sympathetic to Zeppelin and hard rock, including Stephen Waxman, Robert Walzer, and especially Susan Fast. But for the most part, I have sidestepped these concerns, and more importantly, the language they generally compel. Instead, I have tried to articulate the mythic imagination at work in Zeppelin's music by submitting in a half-remembered way to their demonic intensity. In essence, I have tried to give the ensorcelled boy I was the temporary reins of a man's mind. The issue of critical enchantment brings to mind a medieval tale about ancient Glastonbury. During one of the darker of the Dark Ages, the story goes, a Welsh saint named Colin set up shop at the foot of the Tor. One day he overheard two locals praise Gwyn ap Nudd, the king of the fairies and the lord of Anwyn, aka the Celtic land of the dead. Colin stuck his head out his cell and told the fellows not to stand in awe of the fairies, who he claimed were most certainly demons. The two guys, who I imagine looked something like John Bonham, snarled at the saint, warning that he had just earned himself a face-to-face meeting of Gwyn. Colin retired to his hovel until the king of fairies sent one of his roadies to fetch the saint to the top of the Tor. Realizing that resistance was futile, Colin eventually took some holy water and climbed to the hilltop, where he found himself surrounded by a castle filled with glamorous musicians, court retainers, and beautiful young women. King Gwyn sat in a golden chair and offered Colin something to eat. Colin, wise to the ways of fairies, declined the goods. Gwyn then asked the saint if he admired the red and blue liveries of his roadies. The dress is good of its kind, answered Colin, but the red is the red of burning fire, and the blue is the blue of freezing cold. In other words, fairy is hell. The saint flung his holy water around him. The castle vanished, the fairies disappeared, and Colin stood on the windy Tor, alone. And that is where we stand today, at least most of the time, alone on an earth whose ancient spells have dissolved into thin air. In this, Colin is a thoroughly modern thinker. Behind the saint's theological claim is the more damning demonstration that pagan glamour is simply illusion, that the visionary realm is just special effects, that the great and terrible Oz is a fraud. Such saintly works of skepticism and exposure is part of what it means to write about culture critically. I have certainly packed my own vial of holy water for the ramble ahead, and plan to use it when I see fit. But I cannot stop my ears from the weird piping on the wind, just as few of us can resist the call of technology's magic theatre, with its Middle-earths and matrixes and passionate Christs. We may still live in the light of enlightenment, but the sun is falling in the west, and the gloaming grows, and the gloaming makes heathens of us all.
1. Physical graffiti. I don't know if rock matters much anymore, and most of the time I don't really care. But when and where it did matter, it mattered, at least in part, because it was matter. Literally. Among its many meanings, rock signified an inscribed disc of petroleum product wrapped in a more or less vibrant and compelling cardboard square coated with words and images. Whatever airs the music wore, of sex or transport or rebel fun, rock was also a thing, a manufactured and packaged chunk of media whose stimulating powers over body and soul lay coiled in a black groove, awaiting the vibrating probe of an electrically charged machine. For a long time, music fans collected these discs in their CD spawn the way people putter about their gardens. We stocked fresh new bulbs, weeded and trimmed, let sections go fallow, and complained about not having enough space. Occasionally, we passed on cassette tape cuttings to friends or potential dates. But then the infectious virus of the MP3 hit, and the culture of collecting and owning music changed. Now, with CD burners and MP3 players, our garden walls are down and everyone's cloning from everyone else. The pirate pot latches on, even as record corporations move in like Monsanto, maintaining control over the genetically engineered files they pretend to sell to us. The music consumer is becoming what Julian Dibble calls a tenant farmer, buying licenses rather than chunks of sound. Our physical collections, dusty, increasingly disused, seem more like ruins than living libraries. This is what Marshall McLuhan meant when he said the medium is the message. The formal characteristics of music recordings change our experience of them. There are many ways that the digital regime has refashioned our lives with music, but the one I want to emphasize here is how our relationship to recordings has become increasingly incorporeal. Once your music is data, then its material case, if it even came with one, is basically dead wood. Without the physical body of the disc to rub up against, writes Dibble, post-Napster consumer erotics comes to rest on the body of information itself. This information fetishism, known to every MP3 hoarder, is the inevitable outcome of the shift from analog to digital recording, mixing, and mastering. Sure, CDs are nifty to fondle, but with the coming of the great god iPod, the CD reveals itself as nothing more than a cheesy plastic pit stop on the road toward the invisible data file. Our collections are growing literally spineless, vaporizing into virtual libraries, sleek MP3 players, those ugly black books of CDRs. And as we turn to streaming services like Rhapsody, the notion that music is stuff at all is melting away. There is a curious fitness in this disappearance, at least as far as music goes. For nearly all of its ancient human life, music was, in its sensory presence, an essentially incorporeal affair. The San Francisco poet Robert Duncan captured this diaphanous quality when he described the composition of music as a volition, to seize from the air its forms. We made music with our bodies, of course, and needed to be in the presence of bodies, whether lute or larynx, to hear it, but music remained, especially to ears unaware that air is a fluid, an essentially ethereal phenomenon. Its apparently bodiless flow, so like our unconsciousness, explains why, of all arts, music was, and is, the one most consistently allied with spirit, whether that spirit is expressed in the law of Orpheus, or the rhythms of the saints, or the subtle mantras that the Shaharada Tilaka Tantra claims lie behind creation. Music's incorporeal immediacy also helps explain why it retains a spiritual and transcendental power in the midst of so many people's otherwise secular, even nihilistic lives. Records changed the spiritual dynamics of music by subjecting the flux of sound waves to material inscription. Music, once heard only in the moment of its performance, carved a rippling groove that could later reproduce the traces of performance. Music became a kind of writing, mysterious phonograph that was only returned to the realm of air through an industrial contraption. Symbolically, the phonograph record staged a peculiar double movement of drawing living spirit into matter, and then, upon playback, the even more uncanny act of reproducing that spirit, or something like that spirit, from matter. This process lent the phonograph a spectral dimension. As David Toop notes, frozen in time within the grooves, a voice, an instrument, a sound becomes the living dead and is worshipped in the way that a loved one, deceased, may be adored for years by the bereaved. It is not surprising that Edison, who tried to contact spirits through radio waves, considered the phonograph his favorite invention. Ghosts grew in the grooves. Initially, Edison wasn't interested in capturing musical spirits, but in making money from business dictation. Soon, phonograph manufacturers realized that they could sell more machines if they offered ordinary consumer recordings of performers they loved. The Berliner Gramophone Company introduced the rotating disc player in 1896, and by the turn of the century, a new industry was emerging. Audio recordings became commodities, material objects packaged, advertised, distributed, and sold in the marketplace. These recordings provided consumers with scratchy inscriptions of their delights and passions. Their memories and longings, and the intimacy of these grooves, lent records a peculiar power. Walter Benjamin famously argued that mechanical reproduction disenchanted objects of art, but records actually gained aura. For the musicologist Alban Zach III, this transferal of aura lies in the way that records capture physical presence and action. Very Zeppelin-friendly terms for the way that recordings become infused with energy imparted from the interaction of human personalities, embodied now in the form of an artifact with powers of its own. In addition to these powers, which Zach's studio informants consistently identify as magic, records also became some of the mass media's most imaginatively charged commodities, perhaps the culture industry's fetish supreme. We owe the important idea of the commodity fetish to Karl Marx, who first introduced the concept in Das Kapital using the example of a table. To the extent that the table is made of common, ordinary wood, he said, the thing is just a common, ordinary object. But when the table steps forth as a commodity in the marketplace, Marx writes, it is changed into something transcendent. It gains an extra value beyond its simple usefulness. Marx says that the table stands on its head and starts to dance around the room like the shaking tables featured in the spiritualist seances of his day. Marx believed this transcendent glow was an illusion, a displacement of the real source of the thing's value, which was the social character of human labor. Capitalism alienates the relationship between labor and commodity, and the dead things we buy therefore appear strangely animated, almost charged with life force. To explain how this enchantment occurs, Marx turns to the animistic worldview of so-called primitives, where the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life. The commodity thus becomes a fetish, a word he drew from the new science of anthropology and its encounter with West African religion and its various talismans, devil dolls, and warlock gear. From an animist perspective, on the other hand, one might also say that the table dances because its wood was already enchanted. Like all things drawn from nature, the table participates in the creative matrix that shamans and traditional healers believe links human culture and the elements of the earth. The fetish power of commodities, then, is not the only displaced buzz of human labor, but the capitalist trace of an ancient mode of relating to the material world. Whether the source of this relationship is the human mind or the structure of cosmos is ultimately beside the point. What is important is that the glamour and magic of commodities is not simply a spectral effect of technological capitalism, but a transformation, twisted no doubt, and more than a little Mephistophelian, of an imaginative and even ritual relationship to nature, to the matter mother of us all. Vinyl records embody the enchanting power of modern commodities in a particularly potent way. As is now common knowledge, vinyl records represent sound as an analog waveform whose sinuous groove mimics the vibrating waves of sound that ripple through the thin fluid we breathe. The stylus rides the groove like a tiny roller coaster, physically reproducing the fluctuations that shape sound from the air. Analog is an analogy, then, a graven metaphor, and what analog is like is the wave, the undulating continuities that everywhere weave the natural world, from the rolling seas to the rolling hills to the petal of the rose. This inscribed analogy is also a kind of magic. After all, analogy, this is like that, is the basic rhetorical move of spellcraft, which speaks and pictures the hidden correspondences between things, between, for example, planets and plants in the human body. Every yin has a yang, of course, and the flip side of the analog is the digital, a series of ones and zeros that chop up the flowing snake of sense into discrete bits. With digital, we move from analogy to code. The pits on your CD or the charges on your hard drive do not embody the music the way a groove does. These itty bits have many marvelous properties, not least of which is their ability to translate sound into an abstract and essentially immaterial numerical series that, in contrast to the snap, crackle, pop of analog artifacts, can be reproduced indefinitely with near-perfect fidelity. Nonetheless, though digital now rules the roost, people continue to argue for the superiority of analog audio, especially older gear, in a number of domains, from tube amplifiers to electronic synthesis, to effects boxes to high-fidelity playback. Jimmy Page, for the record, prefers AAD to DDD. As digital continues to improve its simulation of analog, defenders of the old order may come to seem rather quaint, like oldsters who write letters in longhand. Despite the real and evident differences in sound quality, though, I suspect there is a non-technical component to the debate, one not merely of taste but of soul. The warmth and body that some analog proponents describe is, in essence, the industrial trace of an ancient way of going with the flow.
A cloak of delight. Rock and roll owes its life to the power of the commodity fetish. All recorded music casts its consumer spells, of course, but rock is the first musical genre that was born as a commodity. Alban Zak notes that rock and roll was unlike any previous genre in that it was first and foremost a recorded music. Its unprecedented commercial success lay less in live performances than in radio, and the new and exploding market for 45 RPM singles, which were cheap and accessible enough to make it into the hands of teenagers. Rock and roll became the devil's music not simply because it transmitted missignated beats to white youth, sparking rebel moves and wayward pleasures. Rock and roll also made a spiritual pact with the commodity form, with matter for sale. For young consumers, the 45 became a personal charm of erotic and energetic powers over body and soul, its lively spin a distant echo of the grind in Elvis's hits. As the rock and roll of the 1950s metamorphosed into the rock of the 1960s, records deepened their hold on the listening psyche. By the end of the decade, technical developments like hi-fi, stereo, multi-track recording, and photographic covers came to mirror the emerging counterculture's multimedia exploration of drugs, sexuality, and spiritual exotica.
Records became amulets of expanded consciousness, but a consciousness that was nonetheless profoundly embodied. The scruffy primitivism and whole food ethnophilia of the counterculture represents a conscious embrace of natural life, a spiritual materialism mirrored in the rituals of rock. Rock is rock, after all, an element of earth. Rock is, or at least has the potential to be, bass, slow, grungy, heavy, hard. Can you dig it? Rock is as low as the vibrations go. The philosopher's stone without the philosophy. And rock's fetish supreme was the album, which is as much a concept as a storage device. The album transformed a collection of singles into a singular work, a holistic entity that was more than the sum of its parts, even as it diversified those parts through the innovations of the multi-track studio. The album also represented rock's deepening incarnation into matter, because it was only with the album that the album jacket filled itself out as an aesthetic object all its own. Think of Peter Blake's cover collage for Sgt. Pepper's, arguably the first fully realized album, or the Stones' 3D portrait on their Satanic Majesty's request. Strange and beautiful album sleeves appeared across genres and eras of music, of course, but album art achieved its peak of sculptural self-consciousness with the late 1960s and early 1970s rock LP, not coincidentally the moment of rock's greatest self-regard. By 1972, a young PJ O'Rourke was already bitching about the trend in crawdaddy, mocking the spectacle of zippers, trapezoids, and an endlessly unfolding, nearly full-scale Dave Mason with a record, the colour of marbleized vomit. Led Zeppelin, with their unrivaled command over the pop mythos of rock music, began the decade with one of these cornball gimmicks. The front cover of Led Zeppelin 3, which appeared in November 1970, was stuffed with a rotating paper wheel the size of the actual vinyl. When turned, the wheel revealed a swirling candy cane morass of butterflies and band photos that passed through die-cut holes in the sleeve. The original idea had something to do with rotating seasonal planting guides popular with gardeners, but the designer, Zach Ron, followed his own muse. Page thought it sucked. But the guitarist managed to leave his mark nonetheless, causing the phrase "do what thou wilt" to appear on the run-off grooves of the original pressings of the album. "Do What Thou Wilt" is the first chunk of "Do What Thou Wilt Shall Be the Whole of the Law," the faintly ominous cornerstone of Aleister Crowley's magic lore of Thelema. Some copies of Free are also marked with the inscription "So Mote Be It," a ritual cry of approbation, common to Freemasonry and modern Wicca. Both phrases, in their different ways, affirm the magical will and its power to craft reality with ritual utterance. With its garish package and run-off spell, Led Zeppelin 3 marked the degree to which Zeppelin was, from the beginning, an album band. Throughout the course of their career, Zeppelin released no singles in the UK and only a few elsewhere. Not only did this force fans to purchase LPs as if they were 45s, but it gave the group a stage large enough to accommodate their sonic dramaturgy. You worked your way through their songs like you were opening the little fold-out doorways on some raunchy Arthurian advent calendar. The album also allowed Zeppelin to thicken the fetishistic quality of the outer sleeve. Unhappy with the rushed cover for Led Zeppelin 3, the band demanded total control over their next album jacket. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant came up with the design, as well as the radical idea of leaving both jacket and spine unmarked with the name of the band, an album title, or even a catalogue number. Atlantic Records balked at what the company reasonably saw as commercial suicide, but Page held his ground, threatening to further hold up the album's already delayed release by withholding the master tapes. In other words, he did what he willed, or would, or whatever. Atlantic caved, and the album appeared as a textless slab in November 1971. In its various media forms, the record would go on to become one of only a handful of recordings certified diamond, selling well over 20 million copies. Page has explained this mute jacket sleeve as a response to rock critics who slagged the band's previous record, to my mind one of their best. Though the hostility of the rock press toward Led Zeppelin has been overstated, many did chalk up the band's thunderous early rise to cheap tricks, excessive volume, and marketing hype. Stripping their famous name off their fourth record was an almost petulant attempt to let their great work symbolically stand on its own 2 feet. But the wordless jacket also lent the fourth record charisma. Fans haunted for hidden meanings, or, in failing to find them, sensed a strange reflection of their own mute refusal to communicate with the outside world. From the lemons critics hurled their way, Zeppelin had squeezed lemonade, mystique. This conscious communication breakdown helped create one of the supreme paradoxes of rock history, an esoteric mega-hit, a blockbuster arcanum. Stripped of words and numbers, the album no longer referred to anything but itself, a concrete talisman that drew you into its world, into the frame. All the stopgap titles we throw at the thing are lame. Led Zeppelin 4, Untitled, Rune, Zozo, 4 Symbols.
In an almost Lovecraftian sense, the album was nameless, a thing from beyond, charged with mana, and yet this uncanny fetish was about as easy to buy as a jockstrap. Strictly speaking, however, the album is not nameless. As the LP labeler 1993's complete studio recordings box set made clear, the album's name is those four esoteric symbols. At the time of the album's release, Atlantic went so far as to supply trade magazines with the fonts so they could list the record on the charts. Like the YHVH Yahweh of the Jews and alchemists, those four esoteric symbols are unpronounceable, a verbal tangle that underscores the most important thing about these four sigils, but they seem to communicate something without saying anything at all. When confronted with such inscrutable signs, our natural impulse is to decode them, to know what they mean. But when it comes to those four esoteric symbols, strict meanings are neither their nature nor their function. The sigils and the musical sounds they announce don't mean stuff so much as make stuff happen. And they make stuff happen by frustrating the conventional process of meaning. And this, by the way, is one of the basic procedures of the occult. The signs on the wall are unclear, so they draw you in like strange lights on the horizon, and by the time you see that they're nothing like what you expected, it's too late. You have already crossed the threshold.
The curving path. A grizzled geezer peers out at you, bent over a rough cane with the weight of the wood he lugs. He is clearly a rural dweller, a Paganus, but a 19th century one, wearing a bowler hat and tweed duds decorated with an almost professorial knee patch. An intriguing character, though only a print, we note, framed and nailed to a crumbling wall papered with a drab floral pattern. Upon opening the outside gatefold, we take another step back from the picture of the old man, as what we took to be an interior wall resolves into a ruin, already half torn down. There are shrubs and weeds and more crumbling row houses, while some ugly post-war British tower blocks rise in the distance, already gone slummy. There's a nearly unreadable Oxfam post on one wall. Someone dies from hunger every day. Here there is no reason to doubt Jimmy Page's explanation. The old man on the cover carrying the wood is in harmony with nature. He takes from nature and gives back to the land. It's a natural cycle. It's right. His old cottage gets pulled down and they put him in these urban slums, terrible places. Page reported that Plant found the print of the old man in a junk shop in Reading, while others suggested the fellow may actually be George Pickingill, a 19th century cunning man from Essex whose Christian-bashing covens were claimed by a few fanciful occultists in the 1970s to have influenced both Crowley and Gerald Gardner, the founder of modern Wicca. There's one tiny image of Pickingill online, and both men have the same crab-apple face, but it's tough to say if it's him, and doesn't really matter. The important point is that this exemplar of the old ways is an ordinary modern person, and not a bare-chested warlock besting goblins in some Frank Frazetta fetishscape. Though charged with fantasy, Led Zeppelin's paganism, and especially Page's occult interests, emerged from a real history. From the time of Shelley and Byron, British culture has produced movements and persons who resist the disenchanted landscape of industrial modernity. The Pre-Raphaelites and William Morris, the Golden Dawn, an influential occult order that included both Crowley and W.B. Yeats, and Tolkien. Like many of his fellows, young Jimmy Page alluded to this romantic and often nostalgic cultural current by wearing foppish studs in the 1960s. But Page took it further, collecting pre-Raphaelite furniture, presumably arts and crafts, and immersing himself in Crowley, whose occultism emerged from a fin de siècle matrix of art and decadence that both resisted and embraced the modern turn. "I think I'm basically a romantic," Page told one interviewer in 1970. "I can't relate to this age." Not relating to this age, one looks back for a crumbling frame and imagines another one. That's why the old man is not in black and white, but tinted with funny colours. We are projecting as well as seeing. This projection is the cunning movement that draws us inside the frame, inside the fold of an imagined tradition of magic. At the same time, the old man's back-breaking labour reminds us that harmony with nature is no picnic. The rituals that sustain harmony require physical work, and though one suspects the old man's heavy load is destined for some ritual, some solstice pile or burning man, it doesn't look like much fun to haul. The most ingenious reading of these bundles of wood I've come across refers to a short text that Crowley penned for the third volume of the Equinox, the literary organ for the Astrum Argenteum, which was the magical order he founded after getting booted out of the Golden Dawn. Crowley begins the passage with loosely alchemical imagery. Man constantly strives with those elements in his being that sink, especially the elements of wood and water. Crowley suggests that the appropriate magical tool against these forces is fire, and he looks forward to the time when the law of Thelema shall set the world ablaze. Crowley doesn't expect this blaze to begin with the small dry sticks that kindle quickly and die, nor with the great logs, the masses of humanity. Instead, he looks forward to those middle faggots that will burn long and hard until the great logs blaze. Led Zeppelin, in this reading, see themselves as these middle faggots, the four sticks who will ignite their vast forests of fandom with Crowley's apocalyptic word. The guy who came up with this doozy is one Thomas W. Friend, whose self-published 632-page book, Fallen Angel, The Untold Story of Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin, based on the Stairway to Heaven album, is without a doubt the most exhaustive occult reading of Zepp yet attempted. That such a reading is justified should be beyond argument. Plant was immersed in hippie lore, while Jimmy Page stands as rock and roll's most prominent student of the occult. But did he practice? The facts we know, though widely reported, only tantalize. Page is one of the world's top collectors of Crowleyania, having scarfed up the beast's first editions, paintings, tarot decks, and ritual robes. In 1970, he purchased Boleskine House, an 18th century mansion on the southeastern shores of Loch Ness once owned by Crowley. Page worked on a soundtrack for Kenneth Anger's film Lucifer Rising, a ritual invocation, on celluloid heavily influenced by Anger's knowledge and experience of Thelema. In interviews, Page has mentioned attending seances and practicing yoga. Going out on a limb, one might argue that Page also fits a certain sort of occult profile. An only child born under Saturn, imaginative and isolationist, obsessed with control. But Page has always held his FOF cards close to his chest. We have no idea how he may have passed from theory to practice, though I suspect he didn't buy Boleskine for the views. What Page's occultism has to do with Led Zeppelin's music or Robert Plant's lyrics is another question, of course. Friend believes it explains everything, and that's because the guys in Led Zeppelin are, as he felicitously puts it, four of the most dangerous devil worshippers to ever walk the earth. Friend, you see, is a born-again Christian, but he was a hardcore Zepphead in 1977 when he saw his favourite band at Madison Square Garden during their triumphant return to touring after 2 years of personal strife. During No Quarter, Jimmy Page broke out a peculiar electronic instrument called the theremin, whose uncanny soundscapes he had been exploring since the psychedelic file drill in the middle of Whole Lotta Love. When Page began to wave his hands around the instrument's 2 antennae, Friend, who was both dizzy and stoned, felt a quick narcotic rush as the space around him filled with demons. He was overwhelmed with the temptation to give his will over to Satan. He resisted, and 30 years later wrote and published Fallen Angel to warn other fans about the infectious diabolism that lurks at the core of Led Zeppelin's music, and especially those 4 occult symbols album. To complete his task, Friend wrote over 30 of Crowley's books, and he now has a better handle on occult Kabbalah than he does on all but the crudest strains of fundamentalist Christianity. The fellow is no scholar. He cites an illustrated Wizards and Witches Time Life book and quotes a Faust as a source, the fictional character that is, not the text. He makes much of synchronicities and numerology and takes poetic language for supernatural fact, which makes the more imaginative passages in his book entertaining and occasionally illuminating. Unfortunately, Friend's final interpretive move is maddeningly predictable. Every mythic figure who struts across the stage, Apollo, King Arthur, Horus, turns out to be Satan in disguise. Fool your favourite rock musicians, his eternal acolytes. Even ABBA gets exposed for the devilish pacts alluded to in the title of their box set, Thank You for the Music. Probably the most famous soul swap in rock and roll lore was committed by Led Zeppelin, who supposedly pulled a Robert Johnson in exchange for musical greatness. If so, they certainly got a better deal than the Delta bluesman who died at age 27, probably poisoned after making a handful of largely poorly selling sides. The Zepp rumor was tawdry teen mag stuff, but its cheesy ubiquity attests to the band's power to make mass mythology with teeth. Just compare Zepp to the Stones. Darkside dabblers widely embraced as bad boys by the press. Yes, the Stones doffed Papa Geed top hats and expressed sympathy for the devil. But who really holds more satanic majesty? Eurotrash Mick with the NBA or the Priapic Pan from Birmingham? Charming Charlie Watts or the potentially barbaric John Bonham? Or try running this little thought experiment. You step into an elevator and there's Keith Richards leaning against the wall grinning at you. You murmur something fanish and grateful, or that this grizzled, fabulously wealthy wraith still walks the earth. Now imagine you're in the same situation, facing Jimmy Page, silent, feline, ominously puffy. You probably just want to get the hell out of there. Taken literally, Zepp Satanism is silly, but as a figure for their cultural power, it warrants attention, especially when brought to you by an imaginative, if paranoid obsessive like Thomas Friend. One of Friend's most audacious but intriguing claims concerns the image on the inside of the album's gatefold, which was conceived by Page and brought into being in pencil and gold by his friend Barrington Colby. Atop a mountain stands another old man, an idealized geezer based on the classic Rider-Waite tarot image of the hermit, a symbol of self-reliance and wisdom, according to Page. For the hermit is usually read as a figure of solitary illumination. Here he waits for a scruffy seeker below to make his way up the mountain. This ascent is mirrored in Page's fantasy sequence during the film The Song Remains the Same, which shows the guitarist climbing up a mountain and to encounter an old man, also played by Page, whose face goes through various lysergic morphs so the figure waves his wand, itself a psychedelic echo of Page's own onstage use of the violin bow. Friend points out that the sequence was shot behind Boleskine House on a full moon night. He also reminds us that Crowley bought the isolated mansion in 1899 in order to attempt the arduous operation of Abramelin the Mage, the successful completion of which results in the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. For Phelamites, this close encounter with the HGA, aka one's daemon or higher self, signifies the discovery of one's true will. Friend claims that Crowley contacted the HGA at Boleskine and that Page purchased the place to perform the same operation. Stephen Davis reports that Page also hired the Satanist Charles Pearce to restore some of Crowley's murals. Unfortunately, Crowley's diary strongly suggests that he encountered his HGA much later, down in Surrey, where he was hiding from his wife and experimenting with hashish and prayer. Nonetheless, there is a certain crazy charm to Friend's claim. Friend notes that Zeppelin did not tour during the fall of 1970, a break that ended only when the band gathered in December to begin rehearsing and recording their fourth album. Though the time frame was rather cramped by true Solomonic standards, Friend believes that Page succeeded in contacting the HGA, who of course is actually Satan, but this triumph is mirrored in Colby's Gatefold, the later fantasy sequence, and the phenomenally popular music on the album. And that's why the band didn't put their name on the jacket. They didn't write the music. Satan did. Of course, Jimmy Page probably just spent the fall of 1970 getting stoned, playing guitar and listening to Band of Gypsies and The Trees. But there are certain peculiarities about Colby's image that should be noted. There is one significant difference between Colby's hermit and the Rider-Waite image, a difference Friend notes with an admirable clarity. There are horns sticking through the hood. There is another surprise beside this hint of diabolical iconography. If you hold the gatefold open vertically and place the right side of the image along a mirror, a beast will shape itself out of the mountain rubble and leap into your eyes. Go ahead, try it at home. Is the beast a dragon? A hound of hell? The black dog? Friend does not discuss this simulacrum, although he does claim to find an image of a hawk tucked away in Colby's mountain. After performing a lesser banishing ritual and meditating with this image for a few hours, however, I believe that this avian totem is actually a penguin. How do we account for these creatures that form themselves from random squiggles? Think back to when you were a kid and elephants and pirate ships form themselves on the fly from floating clouds or weathered stone. Those spontaneous cartoons remind us that our brains are not just passive receivers of data, but active projectors of meaning, constantly weaving the information they pick up into holistic perceptions. In certain situations, these projections draw heavily from the dream store of the imagination, especially when the visual data is shadowy or ambiguous, a liminal condition that makes our projections tend toward the fantastic. Leonardo da Vinci famously suggested that novice painters should spend some time staring at stained walls and molted rocks until the likeness of divine landscapes emerged. This phantasmagorical response to visual ambiguity also explains why the slanted shades of twilight can lay a fairy glamour across the land. It also explains the alternate name of Colby's drawing, view in half or varying light. The word view here, which you might take to be a noun, may actually be a command. By viewing the drawing in half, mirrored, or varying light, the drawing's capacity to invoke your imagination is enhanced. You get it? The beast is inside you. Magic runes. Yanking out the inner sleeve from the gatefold, we come across the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven, some recording data, and 4 peculiar symbols emblazoned on the parchment-coloured paper. These notorious symbols, or sigils, concentrate and refract the mystery of the entire record. The first thing that must be said is that there are 4 of them. They appear on the 4th record released by a quartet, a record that features 4 songs on each side. On a talismanic disc like this album, all these fours suggest the most fundamental of occult quaternities. Earth, air, fire, and water, the 4 elements once believed to make up the whole of material reality. As Crowley suggested in the quote from the Equinox cited above, these elements are also spiritual qualities and were decisively linked to the 4 suits of the tarot deck by the French magus Eliphas Levi in his influential 1855 book Dogme et Rituel de la Batte Magie, which kickstarted the modern occult revival. Levi expanded magic's network of correspondences by correlating earth, air, fire, and water to, respectively, discs, swords, wands, and cups. John Bonham's sigil, later emblazoned on his single bass drum, is made up of 3 discs. For only a tad bit more imagination, we can see John Paul Jones's sign as 3 stylized cups knotted together over a central circle. Earth and water are bass elements. Jones played bass and Bonzo was bass, at least when he was drunk. The wordsmith plant's feather clearly belongs to air, the element of speech and thought pictured by the tarot as the suit of swords, one of which Plant wields in his fantasy sequence in the song remains the same. And to Page, of course, goes the element of fire, of transformative energies and the magical will. In Levi's scheme, fire and will are associated with the suit of wands, or violin bows. Besides including a number of wand-like shapes, the Zorro slash of the Zozo symbol recalls the electrical fire of lightning, the spark of the alchemical process. When music critics attempt to describe the synergy that great musical combos can generate, they often fall back rather loosely on the notion of alchemy. In alchemy, which differs from chemistry in its sensitivity to psychospiritual dynamics, various base materials are combined, sometimes under great tension, in order to transform those substances into things rare and noble. Alchemy is the metallurgy of the spirit, and so makes a fit analogy for music, perhaps the most spiritual of arts. But with Led Zeppelin, we move beyond mere metaphor, or at least to the magical edge of metaphor, for in sound and spirit the band invoked elemental forces to craft their song soundscapes and song. Many of the group's unique characteristics, their drama and dynamics, their range of genres and moods, their imaginative command of tremendous success, speak to their ability to creatively combine and contrast basic musical elements into transforming presences. And Zeppelin 4 is their great work, where they turned lead into gold, then platinum, and finally diamond in the ultimate fusion of hardness and light. Page asked the band to choose their sigils from an existing source, Rudolph Koch's Book of Signs, but Plant and Page wound up designing their own. Typical, really, Jones later noted. Koch was a German type designer and artist, and his collection of ancient and medieval glyphs was primarily intended as a source book for graphic artists. Though brief explanations are attached to the signs, Koch's intent reminds us that the band's sigils have no more necessary meaning than most elements of design. Is there a meaning to the nifty arts and crafts typeface that Page lifted for the Stairway to Heaven lyrics on the other side of the sleeve? Or just a vibe? Part of the cleverness of these sigils is that they compel us to decode them. It is not enough to simply watch them whip around the spindle of a turntable, blurring design into op-art phantasmagoria. They must be made to speak. Page claimed that Jones's glyph represented skill and flair, but Koch tells us that it was used to exorcise evil spells. This fact helped fuel the pervasive lunchroom rumor that, while Jones's bandmates had sold their souls to the evil one, the keyboardist and bassist refrained.
a bit of tabloid lore vaguely supported by the fact that Jones bopped along through the band's tenure while his mate suffered from heroin addiction, alcoholic asphyxiation, a devastating car accident, and the death of a child. The three circles in Bonham's sigil can be associated with any triumvirate you care to name. Coke mentions the Christian Trinity, but in Crowley's Thoth deck, where the glyph appears in the hands of the Hierophant, it symbolizes the Thelemite trinity of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, or the more esoteric triumvirate of Nuit, Hadit, and Ra-Hor-Khuit. One suspects that Bonham just liked the round drumhead shapes, or their resemblance to the overlapping rings left by pints on a bar. The latter, inebriantist interpretation seems confirmed by the sigil's appearance on the label of Ballantine's beer, where it stands for purity, body, and flavour. Robert Plant, possessed of tremendous body and flavour, but perhaps less purity, most likely plucked his phallic feather from Colonel James Churchward's Lost Continent of Mu, a classic lost civilization potboiler no doubt squirreled away on Plant's bookshelf. Churchward links the symbol to Egypt, where in actuality a single upraised feather represented Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. When we die, the ancient Egyptians believed, the black dog Anubis will usher us into the Hall of Two Truths, where our heart will be placed on a scale and weighed against Maat's ostrich plume. If our hearts are weighted with wickedness, we will find ourselves torn apart by the slobbery jaws of Amat. If not, we get to pass on to the fields of peace. The feather's implication of judgment is, I believe, far more important than the suggestions of quill pens and poesy. Final reckoning is all over this record, from Battle of Evermore to the apocalyptic flood of When the Levee Breaks. Jimmy Page's sigil, emblazoned on his amps and sweaters as well as the fourth record, is the holy grail of Zepp lore. Exegetes have ranged widely, invoking everything from Curious George to the Egyptian pyramid of Zoser to a Nintendo Star Trek video game. Inevitably, Satan's sleuths-like friend have found the dreaded 666 in the figure, and their source, a key in Crowley's Equinox which equates to a numeral 6 with a dotted circle, seems solid enough. The question of why the second 6 is represented by a squiggly S remains open on this matter, I submit to friend. Think of how stupid that symbol would look if there were 3 O figures with dots in the middle. The most satisfying conventional solution to so-so begins on In the Light, a website run by a Kiwi mystic named Duncan Watts. Here Watts posts a scan of a schematically similar sigil inked, he writes, by the mathematician and astrologer Jerome Cardan in 1557. Cardan used the glyph to represent Saturn, the heaviest of the planets and the one that rules Capricorn, which also happens to be Jimmy Page's natal sign. But Page, ever the appropriator, seems to have lifted the symbol whole from Le Dragon Rouge, a particularly nasty French grimoire that appeared in the early 19th century but claims much earlier origin. Rumours tying Page's symbol to this rare book of black magic have been circulating for years. Robert Gordon reports the claim in his chapbook on Led Zeppelin 4, but does not confirm it, and confuses matters by writing that Page's sigil is supposed to be upside down. In Robert Blanchard's 1995 translation of The Red Dragon, which reproduces the original French, we find the definitive answer. The identical twin of Page's symbol, right side up, is a group of sigils dedicated to Saturn. Though a clever Zepp head could have pulled a Necromonicon here and inserted Page's symbol in the Blanchard text as a hoax, this seems highly unlikely. Zozo is Saturn, the Dark Lord of planets. But there is something unsatisfying about all this cryptoanalysis. Zozo is both less and more than a code that can be deciphered. The most revealing thing Page ever said about the sigil he told to Richie York. A lot of people mistook it for a word, Zo-so, which is a pity because it wasn't supposed to be a word at all, but something entirely different. This suggests something more unusual than a titled up astrological glyph, and I believe the answer lies in another connection noted by Zepp Kabbalists, the similarity of Zozo symbol to Zos, the magical name of the British artist and magus Austin Osman Spare. Spare, who was born in Capricorn in 1886, was the most radical of the pre-war occultists, and his sexual and magical obsessions were, if anything, more dank and diabolical than Crowley's. Though Spare studied briefly with the beast, he turned his back on esoteric tradition and embraced Freud, Nietzsche, and a psychic automatism that was surrealist avant la lettre. A remarkable draftsman,
Spare placed sigil magic at the core of his work. He called these figures monograms of thought for the government of energy. Spare rejected the received iconography of occult tradition. For him, there was no correct or incorrect sigil, no predetermined mystic attribute such as Coke gives. Instead, sigil magic was a kind of creative autosuggestion. Spare's method was to write down a particular desire, magical or otherwise, and then obsessively condense and recombine the letters into a figure. This sigil was then communicated to the subconscious through an intense trance state. Drugs and sex, solo or otherwise, help here. Spare insisted that, for a sigil to really work, the conscious mind must forget about the original intention. In any case, Spare's sigil magic moves us away from the question of meaning towards the creative act of inscription itself. The sigil is not a signifier, but a graven image of energy, a frozen imprint of physical desire that has a material life of its own. In other words, a sigil is a lot like a rock record. Perhaps this explains why the only design element shared by all four sigils in Led Zeppelin 4 is the disc. Page's two rings even have holes in their centers. The rock LP was, in the earlier 1970s anyway, a shrink-wrapped amulet, a plastic pentacle that invoked powers of the air. It cannot help but recall magical seals like the Sigillum Diameth made by Dr. John Dee, the Elizabethan magus whose Enochian symbol of magic was much beloved by Crowley. The sigillum, now on display at the British Museum, is an uncoloured disc, 9 inches in diameter, inscribed with a complex magical diagram that helped Dee invoke angelic beings. Like the original phonograph cylinders, which Crowley himself used to record some Enochian calls in the 1920s, Dee's pentacle was made of wax. When Page etched Crowley's motto onto Led Zeppelin 3, he was tipping his hat to this legacy of magical inscription. Like Led Zeppelin 3, the original pressing of Led Zeppelin 4 included messages in the runoff matrix. Side 1 read, Pecco Duck, while Side 2 featured the ominous Porky. Scholars of esoteric have burned the midnight oil over medieval bestiaries in the darker tomes of sex magic before realizing that these inscriptions simply referred to the man who cut the masters, George Peckham of Porky's disc cutting service.